Okay, so folks, as Netanyahu issues threats to the people of Lebanon that, hey, if you don't rise up and overthrow the government, you're going to end up like Gaza, expanding this war into greater Israel. Now it seems like it is a matter of when, not if, you will have an official start of the Third World War. Liam Cosgrove, who's done some great work for the Grayzone in D.C., he's the one who famously caught up to Jamal Bowman about a year and a half ago and pressured him on Ukraine funding. That's the viral clip for Bowman. Putin's a madman. That was Liam Cosgrove chasing him down. So here's Liam Cosgrove finally offering a moment of catharsis, saying what we've all been sort of thinking for the past year or so, vis-a-vis Count Morlock of the State Department, Matthew Miller.
So Israel is still poised to strike Iran, and in July, Blinken said that Iran was 1 to 2 weeks away from developing a nuclear weapon. So I guess for all we know, they might have one by now. And meanwhile, in Ukraine, they've struck deep within Russian territory several times, as deep as 300 miles from the border. And in that case, we don't have to guess. We know that Russia has the largest nuclear arsenal on the planet, as many as 6,000 warheads. And so one of the risks of arming militaries that are striking in the territories of nuclear powers is that one of those gets deployed, and then it could escalate very quickly from there. So it's rarely discussed, but it's important to address that the nuclear risk is real, and it could very abruptly mean the end of what humans have worked for thousands of years to collectively achieve. And us today are very lucky to live with the fruits of that achievement, and I feel like we're treating the risks kind of brazenly. So my question for you is, we often hear in response to these concerns that, well, Putin, Khamenei, they're war criminals, they're terrorists, as if they're too inherently evil or immoral for us to negotiate with. But meanwhile, this administration has financed a genocide in Gaza for the last year, and every day you're up there denying accountability for it. So, I mean, what gives you the right to lecture other countries on their moral...
So if you have a policy question for me, I'm happy to take it. If you want to give a speech, there are plenty of places in Washington where you can give a speech.
Yeah, but people are sick of the bullshit.
He asked you a question. He said, what gives you the right to lecture other countries about human rights violations? That's a valid question. He was setting it up there a little bit because most people in Washington never hear arguments like that. That's part of the reason why we are stuck in a doom election between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris, because these questions are not asked in the D.C. area. So he did ask you a question. He took 60 seconds, God forbid, to set it up and then asked you what gives the United States, the State Department, Antony Blinken, who has a lot of smoke for all of these foreign leaders who violate human rights as we fund the genocide and agitate for nuclear war. That's a question. That's a real question. He's not soapboxing there. He set it up for a minute, God forbid.
Has no one thought of bringing in a full-length mirror and running up to him with it?
Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah, that
once people see that he doesn't cast a reflection.
Yeah. He asked the question.
Will be revealed.
Let me put this back and then the capper on this.
They're terrorists, as if they're too inherently evil or immoral for us to negotiate with. But meanwhile, this administration has financed a genocide in Gaza for the last year, and every day you're up there denying accountability for it. So, I mean, what gives you the right to lecture other countries on their moral...
So if you have a policy question for me, I'm happy to take it. If you want to give a speech, there are plenty of places in Washington where you can give a speech.
Yeah, but people are sick of the bullshit in here. I mean, it is a genocide. You are abetting it, and you are risking nuclear war in Ukraine for this proxy war.
Plenty of other places to give a speech. Go ahead.
Thank you, Matt. Bangladesh is...
Moved on. I mean, good for him for finally saying that, And like I said, I think it's a legitimate question. On what authority do we lecture other countries about human rights? Because Antony Blinken, who this guy works under, makes a lot of speeches to that effect. So what gives you the authority to do that, given the fact that you're not willing to negotiate with a nuclear power in Eastern Europe, and you're funding a genocide right now? Like, why should we heed the words of your boss? That's a real question. That's a legitimate question.
Well, these are the last days of American impunity. We didn't have enough time, but there was an interesting interview with Lavrov that just came out, and I believe it was Newsweek. And he laid out what the Russian terms are, for not just a ceasefire. He specifically said beyond a ceasefire, permanent peace,
An end to the war. Yeah.
an end to the war. And, essentially they keep the territories in the east. They keep the Crimea. Ukraine agrees never to become nuclear, never to be part of NATO. Basically what they've been saying from the beginning of
From
the
before
war.
the invasion, which would have avoided the whole war.
From before the invasion. And, in fact, they probably could have saved the Eastern Territories as independent provinces if they just accepted it before he felt compelled to invade.
Correct.
But one of the things he said that was very interesting was the world is changing, and the America seems to be the last one that hasn't caught up. These old arrangements and circumstances are not going to hold anymore. We're going to have to make new agreements that reflect the world we live in now. Basically saying the old post-war NATO hegemony is over. That's it. You're going to have to adjust to to BRICS, to China, to other rising powers, to America being 1.8 trillion in debt, right? Having this possibly unsustainable levels of debt. We're paying as much interest now as we pay for the military budget, which in and of itself, the military budget is a disgrace. So yeah, man, these are the last days, I think, when America is going to be able to conduct itself with this kind of cavalier arrogance, especially because it has lost all pretense to moral authority. America will really never be able to lecture the world on human rights again without being laughed at.
Right, because all of that quote-unquote goodwill that we supposedly had after the Cold War on our side, and I say quote-unquote because there was never any real goodwill. We had a chance to
it
make...
depended. In some countries, yes, some places no.
But what I'm saying is we had a chance to make permanent peace with Russia after the Cold War, and we chose not to. So that's what I mean. But there was never really any goodwill on our part that was earned.
Sure. I thought you meant globally.
No, I'm just saying, like, if we wanted to actually create permanent peace with Russia, we had the opportunity to after the Cold War.
Sure.
We chose not to, and we chose to continue to antagonize them.
We sent in Goldman Sachs to rape them.
Exactly. So there was never any real goodwill, but there was the appearance of at least calm waters.
Right.
And we have now squandered any appearance of goodwill or any illusion of goodwill that came with that time, to the point where now, as he was saying, which is why it was important that he set up his question the way he did, as he was saying, given the fact that we are more interested in demonizing these foreign leaders than negotiating with them for the purpose of avoiding annihilation, because these are nuclear armed powers, we have a responsibility as human beings whose first purpose is supposed to be, at a very basic level, perpetuation of the species. Don't we have a responsibility as human beings to negotiate with nuclear armed powers? Why are we more and we seem to be much more interested in demonizing them, which is only going to increase the chances of a nuclear conflict. And then obviously the most egregious human rights violation of our lifetimes is happening with the support of your boss as he lectures countries like Russia, Iran, and China on the issue of human rights. So the reason the age of impunity is over is because those questions are becoming impossible to ignore. Now, when they come up in a State Department briefing room, what does he do? He brushes them aside. And this is why I say this is how you get yourself into an electoral space that's so hopeless, because all of that consciousness is deliberately filtered out of the electoral process. It's deliberately filtered out to the point where when you go to a campaign events, like when I was going to New Hampshire and you go to a Nikki Haley rally and she's talking about benefits being doled out for Social Security, right? She's talking about all of these, very kitchen table issues amongst middle-class Americans. Well, what's happening to the middle class? It's shrinking. The people who those issues have any relevance for is shrinking. Those are the people who decide who wins and who loses. That's why the election is so close. Because despite the Biden administration's record, there is this abortion issue which really animates middle-class suburban women. And so that's where the decisions are made now. We don't ask these questions of anyone in power anymore. That's why when he got that question, he just insulted him. Well, if you're going to soapbox, there's plenty of places to give a speech. Moving on. They deliberately suppress and ignore questions like that and thoughts like that and ideas like that. They can't let that into the political space in a mainstream way, because once that happens, anything can happen. All bets are off. That happened to a certain extent, not around this set of issues, but in 2016. That's what happened. You had this populist surge where all of a sudden the very underpinnings of globalism and free trade were questioned all around the world. And what did it do? It just flooded into the space to the point where it was unstoppable. That's why you had Brexit. That's why you had Trump. They can't have that happen again, and they have adjusted. They've gotten smarter. That's why this race is 50-50.
Please clap.